Let's see, who was not here last month? Okay. Well, we'll just review a few of the things. I mean, we went, what, a couple hours? I can't repeat the whole thing. So a little background on the Grail. We'll just begin with that, some history here. Summary of the Grail literature, and this is from actually a pretty good book. It's kind of scholarly if you can handle a little bit of a scholarly approach to it. But Roger Sherman Loomis is considered one of the preeminent Grail scholars of the last 50 years. So he kind of gives this summary of the preeminent literature. The Conte del Grail, or Percival, that was by Chrétien de Troyes. As it says, he was a poet of Champagne for Philip, Count of Flanders. There was 4 long continuations of the same. 2 were anonymous, one by Menessier and one by Guibert de Montreal. Parzival by Wolfram von Eschenbach. This is my favorite one. I mean, he really gets into, he's very explicit on the cosmic connection with the Grail. And this, as it says, was the main inspiration for Wagner's Parsifal. And then the Welsh prose romance, Peredur, which was part of this collection called the Mabinogion. The Dido Percival, a French prose romance so called from the name of a former owner of the manuscript. And Parlez-vous, which I think you can download this online if you're interested. I think if you go to Google Scholar, I think you can actually download this. I think that's where I might have, I don't think that's where I originally found it, but yeah, I believe you can. And the prose Lancelot, which forms the 3rd member of a vast compilation known as the Vulgate Cycle, the Quest de Saint Grail, or Graal, the 4th member of the same cycle. Mallory, that's Thomas Mallory, had made us familiar with most of the Grail material in the Lancelot and the Quest by his abridged version in books 11 to 17 of the Book of King Arthur. If any of you have ever seen John Borman's treatment of the Grail material in the movie Excalibur, that was taken mostly from Thomas Mallory's work. And if you read through the Grail literature, this is one of the things I was emphasizing last month, was that it's quite varied. I mean, they all describe different things. I mean, if you read through the literature, it's almost quite confusing because of the diversity of descriptive material for the Grail. Like, you come away from it, what is it? What is the Grail actually? And of course, what most people associate with the Grail is the cup or the chalice. Is probably the most familiar symbol that's associated with the Grail, and there's important reasons for that. Joseph de Arimathea by the Burgundian poet Robert Deberon, the Histoire de Saint Graal, the 1st member of the Vulgate cycle. All of these here were all composed within 50 years, from between 1180 roughly and 1230. And I talked about this time of very potent time creatively and philosophically that occurred during the High Middle Ages, when you had the peak of the Templar Knights, the Cathar movement, schools of Kabbalah being established in Spain. You had the troubadours, and that's just the beginning. And of course, the building of the Gothic cathedrals during that era was at its peak, at its pinnacle in that period. The tarot cards made their first appearance on the historical stage during that period of the High Middle Ages. So it was a very incredible time. And last month I talked about how that time sort of emerged in an era where it came right on the heels of the Dark Ages. And it's important to understand what the Grail is talking about. It's important to place it within this historical context. The Dark Ages came on roughly around 540 AD. And it wasn't something that came on gradually. It was something that came on quite rapidly within say, a geographical or rather a geological context. It wasn't something that took many, many years. It gradually shifted in. It was something that now scientists, primarily who study climate change, who've looked at like dendrochronologists, for example, who study tree rings, were able to actually discern that it came on literally within 1 or 2 years, around 536 AD. And I did talk about this last month, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time reiterating that, but just again to kind of establish a context here, what we see was that around between 536 and 544 AD, there was a major climate downturn in the northern hemisphere. And this has now been well documented in the northern hemisphere, throughout Europe, throughout North America. And one of the things that first clued these dendrochronologists to the fact that there had been this climate downturn was the fact that forest growth in the northern hemisphere almost came to a complete halt for about a decade. Now that's a pretty severe event, whatever it was that would happen. If you think that forest growth basically stopped for all practical purposes. If we look at the historical record from that time, what we discover is that there were many references to the pallor, the bleakness of the atmosphere, repeated references to the sun not showing for weeks at a time. So it wasn't just a metaphor. There really was, in effect, a dark age that came over the world, or large parts of the world, around 540 AD. One of the things that happened as a result of that is the climate cooling caused a series of succession of agricultural collapses. In the wake of those agricultural collapses, there was famine. People in Europe, we don't know historically what happened in North America like we do what happened in Europe, but we certainly know that in Europe there were massive famines because of the crop failures and so forth. Those famines left people in a state of malnourishment, and in 542 AD, the Justinian plague came in and wiped out about a third of the population of Europe. Now, for the next 2 or 3 centuries, the climate of Europe and probably all of North America was depressed. It was in a state of cold and damp, and this is what has been referred to as the Dark Ages. And learning pretty much disappeared from the historical stage, except for a few isolated places like the monasteries in Ireland was one place that learning was able to survive during this period. But then we get to about the 900s, and we see that the Dark Ages basically disappear, and what we have is the return of the light. Warmth comes back into the world, into the northern hemisphere. With that warmth came prosperity in its wake, because now you had agricultural abundance. People started being able to eat well again. Lifespans increased. Infant mortality decreased as a result of both of those things. Population began to grow. And so what you had was, at least like in Europe may have been an analog for what was going on throughout the northern hemisphere. What we then see happening is that there was this accumulated wealth. And without a century and a half, roughly, of this prosperity that came in the wake of the warming climate and the increase in agriculture, they were able to begin this amazing enterprise of cathedral building, which required the mobilization of literally hundreds of thousands of craftsmen throughout Europe that had to be employed to build approximately 80 of the great cathedrals and about 500 of the smaller abbeys. And this required an enormous mobilization of social resources and a tremendous amount of wealth, because all of these people, the stone cutters, the carvers, the sculptors, the glaziers, the carpenters, the astronomers, all of these people had to be fed, they had to be paid somehow. And so it required this accumulation of wealth that did not exist during the Dark Ages. And so it was during this period of sustained prosperity that lasted up until the early 1300s that we see the Grail literature emerge. Now, the Grail literature itself refers us back to this period at the beginning of the Dark Ages, and it's all revolves around the enterprise of the quest for the Grail. And what happens in most of the stories, the theme is the same, the characters are interchangeable, but the general themes are the same, is that the kingdom had fallen into decline simultaneously with the king. Now, the king in some cases might have been Arthur, in other cases it might have been Bran, in other cases it might have been Anfortas, in others he was simply called the Fisher King, but in all cases he had gone into was suffering some kind of debility. In some cases it was a sickness, in other cases it was a wound that wouldn't heal, but simultaneously with that, the kingdom itself had gone into a state of debility. And so the quest for the Grail was the seeking of the instrument or the agency by which the health could be restored to the king, but not only to the king, but to the land itself. And for those of you who might have seen the movie of John Borman's Treatment, at the end, when Percival finally finds the Grail after years and years of questing, and he finds out what the secret of the Grail is, how many of you remember what the secret of the Grail was? What? The king and the land are one. The king and the land are one. Now that's a very interesting proposition. And the idea there is that there was this continuum, this linkage between the kingdom, between the land, and between the king. And when the land became debilitated, so did the king, or vice versa, see? So the Grail not only was about restoring the king, it was about restoring the kingdom, about restoring the land, which had fallen into decline. And what we now know is that the land literally fell into decline for several centuries. That was what the Dark Ages was. And so the stories of the quest are set in Arthurian times. Now, most of the references to King Arthur suggest that he was killed in the Battle of Camlan, when he fought his bastard son Mordred, right? That event is usually placed at around 540 AD. So what's interesting is that the quest is set right in that epoch when we know that something happened in the northern hemisphere that caused this climatic decline, that caused this darkness to come over the world. It's almost as if the world for a while became enshrouded. And I will be pulling up some, maybe not tonight, but at some point I'll be pulling up some of these accounts, some of these historical accounts where various monks and chroniclers are talking about the conditions, the environmental conditions, and they're clearly describing something that is quite unusual. They're talking about the cold and the damp and the dark, etc., etc. So the Grail material emerged historically during this period 1180 to 1230 AD, in that half century. But it refers back as setting as back in this period around 540 AD. Got it? Okay. Okay, then he goes on to say, besides the romances listed, there are numerous medieval translations of French texts into other languages: Norse, Irish, Welsh, English, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, German, and Dutch. The total bulk of the Grail romances produced before the Renaissance was prodigious. It is noteworthy, however, that all the basic texts listed above were composed within a period of about 50 years. The earliest Chrétien's poem was written about 1180. So what we come up with here is this, to me, amazing time during history when all of this stuff was going on. The cathedral building, the troubadours, the Templars, the Cathars, the Grail material, all coming in. I don't think this was all just accidental. I think this was part of, almost a conspiracy, if you will, to reveal some of this information to the world at large. And this is why in many of the cathedral depictions where you see Jesus as the master teacher seated between the vessel of the fish, the mandorla, or the vessel of piscus, he's shown there and he's holding in the book is open. Because what they're doing is they're saying we're opening the ancient doctrine, the archaic teaching, and making it available to a wider audience. And I think that was a big part of what that whole period was about. What we see then is that, interestingly, that period, which is now climatologists refer to this period as the MWP, the medieval warm period. And it was during this time that you had colonists going and establishing communities on Iceland. You had Scandinavians going all the way to Greenland and establishing communities on the west coast of Greenland. And this was what was happening in that period from roughly 950 AD up until about 1300 AD. And what happened around 1300 AD is the beginning of the Little Ice Age, the LIA, the Little Ice Age. If you look in the literature, it's usually abbreviated LIA. What happened in the Little Ice Age? Well, the climate cooled again. And during the medieval warm period, pack ice that had come down from the Arctic Circle had receded way back, and it opened the sea lanes. This is why the Scandinavians were able to sail from Europe all the way to Iceland, from Iceland to Greenland. And It was during this period of time that they were actually able to farm on the west coast of Greenland, where it is now perennially frozen ground. Okay, now come about 1300. Actually, it can be pinpointed right to around 1315 to 1320. The cold started coming back into the world, and it was the first phase of the Little Ice Age. And the sea ice began to move south again. And what happened is it choked off the sea lanes, and it cut off communication, first between Greenland and Iceland, then between Iceland and the European mainland. The Greenland colonies went completely extinct. It took about a century or century and a half for them to ultimately fail completely. But with the persistence of the cold of the Little Ice Age, it eventually became impossible. And in the reconstructions of what might have happened to that Greenland colony, it was apparent that they had multiple year crop failures, agriculture collapse. They weren't able to grow the hay to feed the crops and the livestock, and then they eventually ate all the livestock. And then and by the time that they had felt that they thought they were going to be able to recoup, the sea ice had basically come south, closed them off from Europe, and they weren't able to get supplies from Europe. They weren't able to evacuate Greenland to get back to Europe, and so they basically died off. Iceland almost went the same route, but it became nearly unpopulated at the time, but they were able to hang in and recover because Iceland was a little bit more accessible from mainland Europe. So in any case, what happened is we see that there was a series throughout Europe of agricultural collapses and crop failures, which almost like a repeat scenario of what happened around 540. And then you had the bubonic plague that came in, sort of as the coup de grace. After starvation and famine, you then had the plague, and then once again, about a third of the population of Europe died off in the plague. And so you had a period that, and what you see then is that the Gothic cathedrals, that was this amazing wave of activity that was going on suddenly stopped. And that's why there's so many of those cathedrals that are not finished, is because suddenly there's no food to feed the craftsmen, right? And people are dying. There's no labor force anymore. So what they did was they were able to essentially make hay while the sun shined. You know, while you had the MWP, the medieval warm period, they were able to grow wealthy and build the cathedrals and do all of this amazing stuff. And then the cold came back into the world. And so what we see, though, is that it then took, a century or two before European civilization was able to recover from that onset. The recovery actually occurred because the Little Ice Age was in two phases. And right around in the middle of that, there was a warming spell that lasted for about 75 or 100 years. And this allowed European civilization to recover to some extent, so that it had prospered enough that when the second phase of the Little Ice Age came in, they had enough momentum that they were able to weather it much better. Interestingly, the Little Ice Age only came to an end, generally, according to all of the records, both historical, geological, paleoclimatological records, show that it only came to an end around 1850. So it's important when we start talking about modern climate change and global warming and all this, to have this context to realize that the second phase of the Little Ice Age was the coldest time on planet Earth in 10,000 years. In 10,000 years, the glaciers began to grow, and they grew enormously during this time. Not, of course, anywhere near the extent that they had been during the Great Ice Age, but they grew to where basically anybody who has studied the glaciers and glacier growth will say that, yeah, these glaciers during the end of the Little Ice Age had grown bigger than they had been in 10 or 12,000 years. So when we talk about glacier recession, it's important to understand what our baseline is. Okay, now I'm describing all this as a context to try to understand here how the Grail fits into all of this. See, so we had a period of darkness and cold that came on the planet. We then had that terminated by this period of warmth. This period of warmth allowed European society to prosper. During this prosperous time is when we had all of this amazing stuff going on, and then the cold came back and it all came to an end for a short period of time. Now, what is the Grail itself talking about? Well, the Grail, I'm suggesting actually is referring to what I think of as a lost technology, which literally is about restoring fertility to a landscape that has been devastated by these events. And so that's what we're going to kind of get into. Let's continue on here with some of these interesting quotes from some of the writers. Again, Roger Sherman Loomis, who's one of my favorite Grail scholars, he wrote this way back in 1963. He said, "No legend of the Middle Ages, except those endorsed by the Church, has had so strong an evocative and provocative power as the strange fictions which grew up about the Grail. Thanks to Tennyson and Wagner, Galahad and Parsifal have become types of chastity, and the quest of the mysterious vessel has come to mean, on the one hand, a vain following after wandering fires, or on the other, the arduous search for supreme mystical experience. It is not strange that the medieval legends should have engendered in our century so diverse an offspring, for they form a bewildering assortment of battle and banquet, earthy magic and sacramental miracle, blood feuds and mysterious rites. Bewilderment begets curiosity and seeks a solution. And over the last 100 years, scholars and would-be scholars, such as myself, have tried to discover the secrets of the Grail with such contrasting results that the reading public, eager for enlightenment, may well feel more puzzled than ever. The quest of the Grail has led to the Punjab in India, to the palace of Atreus at Mycenae, and the temple of Zeus at Dodona, to the monastery of Montserrat in Spain, to the palace of Chosroes in Persia, and the Christian shrines of Constantinople. Pick up a book on the subject, and you may be told with a great show of erudition that the object itself was derived from the cauldron of the Irish god Dagda, from the eye of the Egyptian god Tahot, from a symbol of the female organ of generation, from a pearl of the Zoroastrian cult named Gohar, from a talisman of the heretical Albigensians, who were basically the same as the Cathars, once adored in a cavern of the Pyrenees, or from a great sapphire, formerly preserved in the sacristy of Glastonbury Abbey. So all of these places have been one way or another associated with the Grail. Glastonbury Abbey, the Pyrenees, the Great Sapphire. All of these images are things that scholars have derived from reading through this Grail material. So it's not just simply to say, oh, it's this cup. You drink from the cup and that's it. Because all of the Grail writers describe it in different terms. See? And that's one of the reasons that it has ended up being so complex and so confusing to the lay public. Reading this, trying to make sense out of it all. If you immerse yourself into this literature, it comes out very involved. He goes on to say that not all these speculations are as fatuous and incredible as they seem, and some find their excuse, if not their justification, in the diversity and the contradictions of the medieval texts themselves. For in them, too, there is a strange disagreement. The Grail may be described as the dish from which Christ ate the Passover lamb at the Last Supper, or as the chalice of the first sacrament. Now, one of the things you're probably all familiar with is this idea of the Last Supper that happened on the eve of the crucifixion, and they ate the Passover lamb and the drank from the cup, and Jesus says, this is the blood of my blood, etc., etc. And they all drank from this cup, and then after the crucifixion, Joseph of Arimathea, who was considered by some scholars to maybe have been the uncle of Jesus, went and recovered his body off the cross and received the blood that was flowing from his side into the cup, right? Then after a series of adventures where he was imprisoned and miraculously escaped, he eventually made his way to Marseille, France, along with Mary Magdalene. According to the legend, she remained behind at Marseille, and he went on to England, where he met up with Arviragus, who was a pagan chieftain. Arviragus, and he was accompanied by 12 monks or disciples, so there was a total of 13 of them. So Joseph of Arimathea arrives in Glastonbury, presents himself to the pagan chief Arviragus, and Arviragus says, I'm going to give you a place to build a temple, or to build a church. And he gives him 120 hides of land, right? And what is a hide of land? A hide of land was considered to be the amount of land that was necessary to support one family. So it was, and then it became standardized at 120 acres, right? So Arviragus gave Joseph of Arimathea 120 acres that was going to be the sacred precinct, right? 120 acres, 12 hides of 120 acres each. Okay, so do that math. What's 12 times 12? 144. Add a 0 after that, so you get 1,440 acres, right? Now, this is a very interesting size for a piece of land, right? At the center of this, Joseph of Arimathea built a small, round, circular church out of wattles, which is basically plant material like vines that can be bent. And they built this small circular church. They set up 12 huts in a circle around it. Now, that maybe a century or two later, somebody came along in the aftermath and encased the original wattle church in lead to preserve it to some extent. Just prior to the beginning of the Dark Ages, somebody came along and actually replaced it with a building whose foundations were carefully designed to be the same size as the original wattle church, right? Now, around 1000 AD, an abbey was built there. It burned down about a century and a half later, and the abbey, whose ruins are now at the site, was now built to replace it. The ruins that are there now have a chapel at the west end called St. Mary's Chapel. St. Mary's Chapel has been very carefully measured by Bly Bond, who was an ecclesiastical architect around the turn of the century. Now, the interesting thing about St. Mary's Chapel is this. It was built, it's a rectangular small chapel, and this is what's there now. And this is the ruins of the abbey that was built in the 1100s. This is St. Mary's Chapel right here. And here is the reconstructed ground plan of the original chapel, or the original abbey, and here's St. Mary's Chapel right here. Now, the interesting thing about St. Mary's Chapel is each time there was a reconstruction, they went to great lengths to preserve the dimensions of the original wattle church, the original wattle hut, right? So when they built this chapel right here, it was built to carefully preserve the foundation dimensions of the previous abbey. When the previous abbey was built, it was constructed in such a way to carefully preserve the original dimensions, right? Now, Bly Bond came along and did the whole analysis of this and the survey of this, came up and came to realize that the whole thing had been laid out on a grid with squares of 74 feet on the side. St. Mary's Chapel turned out to be 68.6 feet long and 39.6 feet wide this way. So 39.6 this way, 68.6 this way. Well, for anybody who's ever studied sacred geometry, that brings us to a very important ratio that's found throughout sacred geometry, and it's the ratio of the vesica, the preeminent feminine symbol, which is the symbol that we find Jesus seated in the portals of all these great Gothic cathedrals, right? Because it's based on the square root of 3. And if you actually do the numbers, divide, if any of you got a calculator in your laptop, if you do, divide 68, Brad, I can catch it. Okay, I'm going to put in 68.6. Can you see that? 68.6. And I'm going to divide it by 39.6. And what, can you read what that says? Can you?
17.
1 point.
Oh, I'm sorry. 1.732323.
1.732 is close enough. 1.732 is the ratio of the length to the width of a vesica. See? So they incorporated that symbolism, that mathematical symbolism, into the dimensions of St. Mary's Chapel. That was not an accident, you see. Now, there's something else that's very interesting about that particular rectangle. We study that rectangle in depth in sacred geometry classes because it has a very unique property called dynamic symmetry. It has a way of reproducing infinite replicas of itself through simple geometrical steps. There's a small family of these rectangles in these proportions that are based upon irrational numbers, such as the square root of 3. If you see this number right here, the one you just looked at, I'm going to hit this x squared button to square that, and basically, in round numbers, what is it?
3.
3. Yeah, so you take that ratio, multiply it times itself, and you get 3, because that number is the square root of 3. Now, in the great Gothic architecture, what you find is that the square root of 3 was one of the key proportions used to lay out the great sacred structures. The medieval Freemasons called it the system of ad triangulum, or of the triangle. Because if you take one equilateral triangle, like this, and another one like this, and you put them together base to base, its length to width ratio is going to be the square root of 3. You see, so in sacred geometry, that's one of the very first exercise we do in sacred geometry is the creation of this vesicum, and it's created by means of two circles that are overlaid on one another, such that the circumference of one falls on the center of the other. If you have one circle in its center, you take a second circle of the same diameter and draw it in such a way that its circumference hits the center of the first one, and vice versa. It's the overlap of those two circles that creates this vesica. And that was the primordial act, if you will. And it was considered philosophically to be like a recapitulation of the primordial act of creation itself. Is the emergence of these two circles, these two symbolical circles. They come together and they merge until circumference lines up with center. And in that overlap, that vesica, out of that vesica, which is considered again like this preeminent feminine symbol associated with the womb, is born the whole edifice of Euclidean geometry, which emerges from that symbol. And it starts with the creation of the equilateral triangle in there. And then from there, a couple of additional simple steps, you can create a square, and that leads you into the ad quadratum system of Masonic geometry, which means of the square. And as the vesica is based upon length to width ratio square root of 3, all squares, their diagonal to their side length is the ratio of square root of 2. Now the square root of 2, the square root of 3, the square root of 5 are like the phi ratio, the golden section, or pi, in that they are non-repeating, non-terminating decimals. They go on and on and on, and they never repeat and they never terminate. This is why they're called irrational. Sometimes they've been referred to as transcendental numbers. But in any case, these numbers are like that. So what we find at the very beginning here is we have this circle. It's 39.6 feet. Now, there's kind of a coincidence here, because we say that the sacred precinct was 1,440 acres, right? Now, who's good with a calculator? Nobody? Are you pretty good with a calculator, Tim? All right. What you're going to do is you're going to put in the number 1,440. Okay, now let's talk about an acre. What is an acre? It's an acre is 1/640th of a square mile. So 640 square acres equals 1 square mile. Okay, so it'll turn out that a square acre, if you quickly in your head take a mile, which is 5,280 feet, square it, right? Divide by 640, you'll get 43,560, I believe. Isn't that right? Okay, so that's the number of square feet in an acre, right? Now, you got 1440 in your calculator, multiplied by 43,560. You're going to get a big old number, right? Now, that's the number of square feet in the sacred precinct at Glastonbury as laid down by Joseph of Arimathea and his 12 followers. Now, to try to get a handle on what that size is, that's the total number of square feet. What we want to do now is take the square root of that number, and it'll give us the length of that square on the side.
7920.
7,920. What's that? It's the number of miles in the diameter of the Earth. So we have an interesting ratio here. What we now have is a proportion. A proportion is that when two ratios are equal. On the one hand, we have a square with a sacred precinct. If we were to draw a circle in there whose diameter exactly filled the square of the sacred precinct, it would be a circle 7,920 feet in diameter. So that circle to the foot is proportional to the Earth to the mile. See? Is that a coincidence? Or is that part of some deliberate scheme of geometry that was worked into this? Now, if you turn to the book of Revelations, the final, I think it's the second to the final chapter, it describes, no, it is the final chapter, I believe, the holy city. It says, John goes into this visionary state. He's the angel comes and takes him to the great and high mountain, and then reveals to him the vision of the holy city. And he says he sees the holy city descending out of heaven, from God out of heaven. And he describes the holy city and says that the holy city lieth foursquare, and the length and the height and the breadth of it are equal 12,000 furlongs. 12,000 furlongs on a side. Okay, now how much is a furlong? Do we have any horse racing aficionados in here? Anybody who likes to gamble at the track? George, you get no? That's the one place where furlongs are still used. Okay. In horse racing. And it's an old English unit of measurement. And it was used in the Bible in the King James English in place of the word stade or stadia, which was in the original Greek, because the stade and the furlong were considered to be counterparts of one another. So when King James had the translation done in the 1600s, they used the word furlong, which was this ancient British unit of measurement. A furlong is 1/8 of a mile. So 8 furlongs equals 1 mile. Now, Tim, put in 5,280 in the calculator, the number of feet in a mile, and divide by 8. And we'll have the number of feet in a furlong. 660 feet in a furlong, right? Now, let's make this even a little more precise. How many inches are there in a furlong? So you simply go 660 times 12.
7,920.
7,920. There it is again. Now what we're getting here is a continuous proportion. We have the furlong to the inch is the same as the Glastonbury sacred precinct to the foot, which is the same as the Earth to the mile. Now, is this coincidental? Maybe. But if it's a coincidence, it's a pretty strange coincidence, isn't it? Now, think about this. If we were to take a measuring tape, and I have actually not, I didn't take my truck tonight, but if I had taken my truck, I have 150-foot fiberglass tape I always carry around in my truck. If I went and I measured out a furlong on the street or a parking lot or something, and I have actually done this, 660 feet. And then I was to take my thumb, and most thumbs, if you press them down, are an inch wide, right? This is where we get the inch from, by the way, just like this is where we get the foot from. And where do we get the mile from? Mile originally comes from the word mil, which means in Latin what? 1,000. So 1,000 what? This. What? 1, 2, 3. If I'm pacing and I do 1,000 paces, that's going to give me a mile, more or less. I'm going to have a longer mile because I'm 6'1". I think if you're about 5'9", your pace is going to be just about right that 1,000 of them will give you a mile of 5,280 feet. But in either case, what we have here is a ratio between the pace and the foot, 5.28, right? And you take 1,000 of those, and now you've got a mile, right? So now if we take the Earth next to 1,000 paces, it's the same as the furlong is to an inch. Now that's very interesting because this takes us into a concept from sacred geometry. Because what sacred geometry is about is studying these linkages between these various scales, these various domains, and leads us into a concept called scale invariance, which basically tells us that regardless of the scale, the proportional relationships remain the same. And I think this is what we were finding embedded in the book of Revelation, and it's also found in the legend of the Grail. And Joseph going to Glastonbury and establishing this sacred precinct, so on the one hand we have the furlong to the width of the thumb, which is where the inch comes from. Then we have the sacred precinct to the foot, right? And then we have the earth to the mile, which is 1,000 human paces. So in each case, what it's referring us back to is some unit of measurement that's ultimately derived from the human proportion. And this is why I think Protagoras said, man is the measure of all things. See? And I think what they're trying to show us here is that built into the very geometry of our own human anatomy are the cosmic proportions. And what we do is when we extrapolate from that, what we're looking for is the geometric mean between various scales of phenomena. So on the one hand, once we're talking about the earth, now we're getting into really the cosmic level, right? But what the temple was, what the cathedral was, what the holy structure was to create a geometric mean between two scales, the human scale and the terrestrial scale. You see? And by creating a geometric mean between these scales, you create the potential for resonance, which I believe is one of the fundamental processes at the basis of what I think of as the Grail technology, resonance. And that's why I elaborated upon this whole phenomena of these interesting proportional relationships. He said that the mile is 1,000 human paces of 5.28 feet each, right? So this is a proportion that's built into the dimensions of the human itself. The human geometry gives us that proportion of 5.28. And because of the fact that, for example, if you're a smaller person, your mile might be shorter than 5,280. If you're a large person, it might be greater. But the proportion between your pace and your foot is going to remain relatively constant at about 5.28 feet, right? Now, you've got, in that calculator, Tim, you had the diameter of the Earth. Put 7,920 in there. That's the diameter of the Earth. Now, we said that the holy city was described as 12,000 furlongs on a side, right? So if you go 12,000 times 660, in fact, erase the 7920 and do this. Go 12,000 times 660, the number of feet in a furlong, to see really what are they describing there. How many feet did you come up with?
7,920,000.
7,920,000. There's that 7920 with just 3 zeros added after it. Now do this. To make that manageable, since nobody can really picture what 7,920,000 feet is, divide that by 5,280 to convert it to miles.
1,500.
1,500 miles. What are they talking about there? I'm not sure. I have a suspicion, but I'm not going to get into that right now. But notice something. What I want you to do, you got that number 1,500 in there? I want you to divide that by the number of the number of miles in the diameter of the Earth. So you got 1,500 divide by 7,920. And you're going to get some number less than 1, aren't you?
Yeah.
Now what we want to do is we're going to flip that over. So what you've got now is the holy city on top, the Earth on the bottom. We're going to flip that, put the Earth on top, the bigger one on top, the smaller one on the bottom. So all you need to do, Tim, is hit the 1 over x key and tell me what you get.
5.28.
5.28. So there it is. Once again, that fundamental human proportion is built into this analogy here, you see. Is this, again, coincidence? Well, what I've only shown you here is just the merest tip of the iceberg of this whole phenomenon, you see. It applies to pretty much everything. The sacred structures that were built all over the planet. whether you're talking about Mesoamerica, whether you're talking about King Solomon's Temple, whether you're talking about Angkor Wat in Cambodia, Glastonbury Abbey, whether you're talking about geometrical metaphors found in sacred writings such as the Book of Revelations, what we're discovering is that there's this consistent geometry, this scheme of geometry embedded in these things. What does it mean? Well, again, I think what it gets us back to is this idea of resonance. That there are these correlations between these disparate realms of phenomena. And they're correlated through number, through measure, through proportion. And in fact, you remember the story about the handwriting on the wall? Mene, Tekel, Ufarshin, something like that. My Hebrew is probably atrocious, but basically it translates as number, measure, and proportion. That's the handwriting on the wall. So these are examples of what I'm suggesting is resonance, this resonant phenomenon. And we've only explored just a few areas because what I'm trying to do is give you the general idea of it. So with that in mind, let's go back to talking about the Grail itself